Hey everyone, welcome to our second video in week 6 of our Kingdom Citizenship module. And these videos are largely in response to some of the feedback and questions that you all have, and I thought it would be helpful to, in this video, walk through a practical but purely theoretical example. Let's just say that there is a virus that is rapidly spreading around the globe, and in order to prevent it, governments start asking that people socially distance and wear masks whenever they're around others, and this includes when churches gather. So, in this purely theoretical example, how should the church respond? Do they follow these orders? Do they follow them for a bit and then stop? Do they just disregard them, see them as infringement on their ability to worship? This is obviously not theoretical, but a very pressing question, one that churches have wrestled with, and there are different views on it. First off, if you are part of Jordan Valley Church, I want to tell you thank you for being an awesome church during this time. Sometimes churches can have more drama than a Sweet 16 party, and I have felt so blessed and humbled by how awesome and drama-free you all have been through this very trying time for all of us. It has been a joy to be your pastor. I want to thank you for that. What I want to do in this video is to use some of the principles that we've developed in these last few weeks to then apply them to this specific situation and hopefully help you see some of the ways that the leadership here at this church has thought through this difficult issue. So, I think probably the central question here is, has the federal government overstepped its authority? If we draw our diagram of those spheres of authority that we looked at the beginning, we saw that Jesus is king over everything. Jesus is king, but then he has delegated authority, and two of the main areas where he has delegated authority is to, we could say, the state, our civil government, and to the church. And the question that we are wrestling with now is, has the state essentially illegally crossed the border into the realm of the church in some of these mandates and guidelines that it's given? So, in the week 3, we looked at how the civil government is given 3 tasks. That they are called to render to render judgment for the sake of justice, to build platforms of peace, order, and flourishing, and then third, to set the stage for redemption. And God then, in the sphere of the church, has given the church the responsibility of making disciples by baptizing and teaching them. So we have some idea of what these 2 spheres' responsibilities are. Now let's get a little bit more specific. How does the mask mandate fit into these responsibilities of these 2 entities? When we look at the first purpose of government, well, the first purpose doesn't relate all that much, to render judgment for the sake of justice. The second, though, it seems like it could. Masks during a time of pandemic could allow for better flourishing if fewer people die because of them. Now, some of you are ready to send me 5 journal articles about how masks are not effective because of this, and hold off on that, and we'll get to that in a minute. The third purpose of government, to set this stage for redemption, well, you could kind of go either way on this one. In one sense, these restrictions make it more difficult for the church to do some of its activities, to meet with folks, to have gatherings. On the other hand, but by preserving life, it does allow us to minister to more people, people that may have not been alive had certain measures not been taken. So we could say that if masks help with the preservation of life, then a mandate is within the scope of the government during a viral pandemic. Now let's look at the authority of the church. Does a mask mandate not allow us to do what God has called us to do as a church? If we put the church's mission under that umbrella of making disciples, well, then certain measures taken during a pandemic can certainly interfere with our ability to make disciples. For instance, during this pandemic, early on, we stopped serving the Lord's Supper. Some baptisms were delayed out of a desire to follow the government's guidelines. In that situation, we do find ourselves in a place where we see the government's authority starting to bleed over into the realm of the church, because things they have said are not allowing us, if we want to do what they say, to do what God has told us to do. So physical gathering and the sacraments, these are essential functions of the church. But it also seems that these are extraordinary times, and there are extraordinary times throughout history, and we can even see so in the Bible, when certain essential aspects of the church are put on pause, or we might not have as robust a ministry as we would like. And these things are not stopped, but they are paused for a period of time. And, well, for how long? When does it become sinful to keep those things on pause instead of starting them again? When does it become genuine government overreach that then needs to be pushed back against? And this goes back to a concept that we looked at last week, the essential role of wisdom. It is just as important in governing the church to have wisdom as it is in governing the state. And we'll unpack this in a little bit more here in a minute. But back to the specific question, do masks prevent the church from accomplishing her mission? Well, we are able to gather for worship. Maybe not like we'd like, maybe not as comfortable, but we can gather for worship. We are able to have the Lord's Supper. We are able to baptize. In other words, we are able to do the key things, the bare minimum of what we need to do in order to make disciples. And in that case, it is hard to make a case, we think, for disregarding the government's rulings in this area. Now, there would be one exception, though. What about someone who is unable to wear a mask for medical or psychological reasons? And because of that mask mandate, they can't come to worship because they can't tolerate a mask. And fortunately, our state has made an exception for this. Certainly that person could watch online, which is a nice temporary measure, but in the end, we have to gather as a church to be the church. But thankfully, even if someone could not wear a mask for medical reasons, they could still attend worship without one and be in line with what our state has allowed. Now, you need wisdom to ask yourself, well, is this me just wanting to bend the rules or circumvent the rules, or is this really a medical necessity? Now, I'm sure a lot of you are saying right now, but what about whatever it might be? So let's work through some of the most common of those but what abouts. But what about the fact that masks don't prevent the spread of coronavirus? Frankly, when it comes to making decisions about what the church does or doesn't do in this aspect, I'm agnostic on the whole mask thing. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's too early to tell for sure, and there are different ideas out there. But we can do what the church needs to do. And our civil government, if we were to give it the benefit of the doubt, and particularly those people who are making the decisions about these things, right, that they're making decision based on what scientists, people that have studied this thing, say, and not because there's some secret conspiracy out there to get everyone to wear masks forever, but because they are genuinely looking at all of the data, the same data that you have access to and I have access to, but they probably are better equipped to analyze it and look at it. And they come to conclusions that certainly aren't totally black and white, but are all shades of gray. Well, can we at least concede that they are trying to make the decisions that skew towards what might help life, and then particularly, even when it's just small percentage points being moved, when you extrapolate that over millions and millions of people, that can have a huge impact on our hospital systems and other things like that. So these solutions and these guidelines none of them are silver bullets, but are things that they hope will skew those percentage points a little bit more towards the side of life than death. Now, you as an individual, you are totally entitled to have your own views on the subject, right? And if you think this is completely off, well, write your political leaders, right? Apply to become the state epidemiologist to set everyone straight. Publish your own studies. Get involved in that sphere. But here's the key problem, though, I see. It is when the church thinks it's a better epidemiologist than the state. In other words, what is happening here that I don't see as many people talk about is the church. Everyone is worried about the state coming into the church, which is a legitimate concern, but we should also be worried about the church trying to then encroach and come into the state's territory. And how could you do that? Well, it would be when you start making your own guidelines because you don't think the states are good enough. And I see that there are, this happens in both sides. There are churches that don't think the states are strict enough, and so they go above and beyond. Or there are churches that think the states are too strict, and so they dial down those guidelines. In either way, I think the church is in danger of coming into the state's sphere. And it seems to me that if we don't want the state to come into our sphere and tell us, dictate things about our worship, then we should also not want to go into the state sphere to dictate to them about how they best preserve life. Next one. But what about how the government is using this as kind of a trial run for encroaching on religious liberty and putting all the churches out of business? Well, this is where I think you have to take it by state basis. Maybe you don't think it's as extreme as that, but you are worried about the precedent this could set for religious liberty. Fortunately, we live in a state that seems very intent on preserving religious liberty. If you look at some of the documents, for instance, the latest frequently asked questions that came out from our state with the new updated guidelines, in it reads, do religious organizations have to fill out the event management template? Which other groups that would, do have to. The answer in this is no. Can I go to church if I live in a county that is high or moderate? Yes. Do the limits on social gatherings apply to religious services? No. Based on what our state has published, it is hard to make a case that they are unfairly targeting churches with restrictions. If anything, actually, they have given churches greater liberty and yet have asked us, but still please follow these general guidelines for all people. Now, that might not be the case in places like California or Nevada or Washington, D.C., where the political landscape is much different. And we need to be careful of reading into what is happening in our state based on what is happening in other states when there are very big political differences. Now, how can you tell, though, if this is an attempt to solidify governmental overreach into the realm of the church? Well, I think two things that we should look for. One, are the guidelines set up in such a way that they set a double standard for different organizations? For instance, are churches given unrealistically high expectations for what they need to do if people want to get together, while, say, an indoor stadium has much lower guidelines that it needs to follow? There's a clear inconsistency there, a double standard. The second area to look at would be if in the place of enforcement. Is there clear and consistent enforcement? So perhaps the rules are fair, but enforcement shows a particular bias against religious organizations or particular religious organizations. Again, we haven't seen any of that here in this state, which we're very thankful for. And it seems like by and large, the government is trying to enforce these things fairly and not show a bias to one organization or another. In any of those cases, if we did see that thing, well, then we would probably want to pause and think more critically and dive in a little bit more on how we deal with that. But as I said, within the state of Utah, we thankfully have not seen that. But what about it's dehumanizing to wear masks? On one hand, I agree with you. It is, right? But we aren't talking about a permanent law, or the government isn't saying that from now until eternity you have to wear masks. This is what seems to be a reasonable and temporary order based on the state's understanding for how best to preserve life. And yes, it does affect how we worship, but it doesn't prevent us from worshiping. It's harder to sing loudly. It's harder to breathe when you're singing loudly. It's harder to have conversations. It's harder to understand people's facial expressions and all of these things. And trust me, I don't want to wear them. Every time we've had a discussion about this, I really don't want to do this. But in the end, I think, you know what? Let's all suffer together and come together instead of letting this divide us. And specifically for worship and wearing masks, all of our worship on this side of heaven, it is always going to be less than ideal because of sin. And one of the effects of sin is that we have diseases and we have pandemics. So of course those things are going to interfere with our worship and make it less than ideal. Whether you can't sing because of a mask or because of a sore throat, those things are going to happen. But brothers and sisters, let's look forward to that day when we are free from sin and all of the effects of sin, and we never have to wear masks again. If anything, let this time help us long for the beauty of heaven and long to experience that. So these are some of the ways that the leadership at Jordan Valley Church has tried to take some of the principles we've looked at here in this study and apply them to this purely theoretical issue. Maybe you don't agree with it in the end, but hopefully you understand our thought process. One final thought. One of my concerns through all of this is you don't have to look very far to see how incredibly divisive this issue is. And my concern has been to preserve the unity of our church around the gospel. One of the great dangers with these divisions between Christians and churches and the coronavirus response is that it threatens to undermine the gospel. I want us to look at 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 13. I appeal to you, dear brothers and sisters, by the authority of our Lord Jesus Christ, to live in harmony with each other. Let there be no divisions in the church. Rather be of one mind, united in thought and purpose. For some members of Chloe's household have told me about your quarrels, my dear brothers and sisters. Some of you are saying, I'm a follower of Paul. Others are saying, I follow Apollos, or I follow Peter, or I follow only Christ. Has Christ been divided into factions? Was I, Paul, crucified for you? Were any of you baptized in the name of Paul? Of course not. Paul is writing into this situation where the Corinthian church was divided. Now it was divided around personalities, which is in some ways, although maybe not totally different than what we're experiencing today. But I think we could probably update the language to say something, well, I don't wear a mask to church, or, well, I do wear a mask to church, or I'm going to go physically to church. No, I'm not going to go physically to church. The danger that when a church goes either above or beyond what our civil government has said, you've not only risked stepping into their sphere of authority, but you've also now elevated, whether you meant to or not, made something that should be a tertiary issue and made it into a main issue for the church. And when that happens, the gospel almost always is undermined. And so what is Paul's solution for this division? He says in the next chapter, verse 2, for I decided that while I was with you, I would forget everything except Jesus Christ, the one who was crucified. And all that has happened, and whatever your views may be on all of this, has that been your focus? Christ and Him crucified? Or has it shifted to something else? Because I can guarantee you what our world needs right now is not some more options about how best to deal with the coronavirus. Not to send someone another study about why masks are effective or why they aren't effective, or why this is government overreach or not government overreach. No, what our world needs right now, more than anything else, is the message of Christ and Him crucified. And let that be what we unite around.